Episode 1, The First Whisper. The town of Ravens Hollow had always been a place shrouded in mystery. Nestled deep within a fog-covered valley, it had a strange, almost haunted allure that seemed to draw those who craved its eerie solitude. Most people avoided the town, either because of the chilling rumors or the unsettling aura that seemed to cling to every crumbling building. The once thriving community had slowly decayed into a ghost town. Empty streets, silent homes, and a never-ending fog that seemed to swallow everything. But Ella Montgomery was different. She had never been afraid of the stories. In fact, she had always been drawn to them. Her family, long gone, had roots in Ravens Hollow, and the whispers about the town had always intrigued her. But there was one story, one whisper, that she had never been able to escape. It was a tale that had been passed down through the generations, a dark legacy tied to her bloodline, a legacy that had begun to haunt her dreams, even after all these years. As a child, Ella had listened to her grandmother's stories, sitting by the fire as the shadows danced across the walls. The whispers, her grandmother had warned, they come for those who listen, and once they start, they never stop. Ella had dismissed it as mere superstition, but now, as an adult, those words echoed in her mind. And tonight, the whispers were louder than ever. Ella's fingers gripped the steering wheel as she drove deeper into Ravens Hollow. Her headlights cut through the thick fog, illuminating the eerie, abandoned houses that lined the road. The buildings seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect, their windows dark and empty, staring out like hollow eyes. Every time she passed one, she couldn't help but feel the weight of 1,000 secrets pressing against her chest. She had returned to the town not just for answers, but for closure. Her parents had died under mysterious circumstances when she was young. Their deaths ruled as an accident. But Ella had always known there was more to the story. Something darker, something that had never been spoken aloud. And now, she was determined to uncover the truth. Ravens Hollow felt different than when she had left all those years ago. The air was heavier, thick with an unsettling energy that seemed to wrap itself around her like an unseen force. She shuddered as she drove past the old church on the hill, its steeple piercing the fog like a forgotten relic. That church, her grandmother had told her, was the heart of the curse, and it was where the whispers had begun. Ella pulled up to the edge of town, parking in front of an old and that had been closed for decades. Her heart raced as she stepped out of the car, the fog curling around her ankles like a living thing. Then loomed in front of her, its peeling paint and broken windows telling the story of a place long abandoned. As she walked toward the door, she noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from one of the windows. It was dim, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Ella's curiosity got the best of her. She approached the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging up the pane. Inside, the room was dark, but she could make out the faint outline of a figure standing in the center of the room. A woman, pale, ghostly, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at her. The figure raised its hand, and Ella's heart skipped a beat. Before Ella could react, the figure vanished, leaving nothing behind but the unsettling silence. The first whisper, the moment the figure disappeared, the air around Ella seemed to thicken. It was as if the atmosphere itself had changed. She turned quickly, her pulse racing, but there was nothing behind her but the dense fog. A whisper cut through the silence, low, almost imperceptible. Yet, it was unmistakable. You shouldn't have come. Ella's breath hitched, her eyes darting to the abandoned and around her. The air grew colder and the fog began to swirl in unsettling patterns, as if something unseen was moving beneath it. The voice came again, closer this time, echoing from somewhere deep within the inn. You've awakened it. Her mind raced. There was no one else in the town, no one but the shadows of the past. But this voice, this presence, it wasn't just a town speaking to her. It was something older, something darker. Ella turned on her heel and ran toward the inn's entrance, her footsteps loud in the silence. Her breath was ragged as she pushed open the door, stepping into the dark, musty hallway. As she walked deeper into the inn, the whispering grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse with each word, each sentence. And then, just as she was about to make her way upstairs, The door slammed shut behind her with a force that sent her stumbling forward. The darkness that enveloped her was thick, suffocating. The whispering had turned into something else now, something urgent, desperate. You must stop it, or it will stop you. Episode 2, The Silent Witness. Ella stood in the dimly lit hallway of the inn. The door behind her slammed shut with an eerie finality. The heavy silence that followed felt suffocating, and yet the air around her seemed to hum with something intangible, something unseen. The whispers, they were no longer just echoes in the background. They were in the walls, in the very air she breathed. Her heart pounded against her chest, a rhythmic beat that seemed to mirror the intensity of the whispers. She could barely make out the words as they twisted through the darkness, their voices layered, fragmented, like a chorus of lost souls reaching out from the abyss. You have no idea what you've unleashed. The voice seemed to say, distorted by the walls. Ella's breath hitched. She spun around, but the hallway was still empty. The inn, once silent and abandoned, now seemed alive with malevolent energy, as if the very building were watching her. She could almost feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, unseen but ever-present, staring from every shadow. She took a step forward, then another, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, as if to warn her. "Don't go any further," came the voice again. "It's too late." But Ella wasn't about to back down. Her curiosity, and something deeper, something more primal, urged her forward. She had to know what was happening here, why the town was cursed, why her family had been so deeply entwined with its dark past. The hallway stretched before her, darkened and foreboding. As she made her way toward the stairs, something caught her eye, a figure, barely visible, standing at the end of the corridor. It was a silhouette draped in shadow, unmoving. Ella froze, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a figure. It was a woman, or at least the shape of one, standing perfectly still in the dim light. Her face was obscured by a veil of darkness, but Ella could feel her presence. The air grew colder, and her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. The figure did not move, but its presence was palpable, like a force that held the entire room in place. "Come closer." The voice was softer now, more like a whisper in her mind than an actual sound, but it was unmistakable. Ella's hand instinctively reached for the banister, her fingers gripping the cold with tightly. She had to know. Step by step, she moved forward, her legs heavy as if the very atmosphere was working against her. The air grew colder still, and she could see her breath in front of her, thick and visible in the freezing air. The figure at the end of the hallway did not move, but its presence grew stronger with each step she took. Ella's pulse quickened. She felt a strange compulsion to approach, as though some invisible force was guiding her closer to the figure. Just before she reached the bottom of the stairs, the figure moved. A cold gaze. The woman's head turned sharply, her eyes glowing a faint, unnatural blue in the dim light. They were hollow, deep, dark void that seemed to pull her in. A chilling wind swept through the hallway, sending the candles flickering wildly as if the house itself were reacting to the woman's presence. "You should not come back," the woman whispered, her voice the softest, barely audible over the rising wind. "The curse has already begun." Ella's stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, as though the house itself was holding her captive. "What curse?" Ella asked, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Ella. There was something familiar about her, though Ella couldn't place it. A memory flickered at the edges of her mind, something she had seen before in a dream, or maybe it was just a feeling. "You're the last one," the woman said softly, as if the word were meant only for Ella. "The last to break the chain." Ella's heart raced. The last to break the chain? She didn't understand. She had come here to uncover the truth. But this was something far beyond her comprehension. The woman reached out, her bony fingers brushing against the air in front of her. The air around Ella shifted, cold and thick, and she felt a sudden rush of dread flood her chest. Her mind spun, and for a moment, everything went black. The mirror, when Ella's vision returned, she found herself standing in front of a mirror, its surface dark and clouded, as though it had not been touched in centuries. She could see her reflection, but it was distorted, shifting like a broken image. The figure, now standing beside her, looked at the mirror with an unreadable expression. Her hand reached out, placing itself lightly on the cold surface. For a moment, there was silence. "This mirror holds the key," the woman murmured, her voice distant. "The reflection is where it all begins. Look closely, and you will see the truth that has been hidden from you." Ella's gaze locked onto her own reflection in the mirror, but something was wrong. Her own face seemed to twist, her eyes hollow and black, staring back at her with an expression of deep sorrow. Then the reflection changed. Her own image was replaced by another, an old man, his face covered in shadows, his eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, his eyes seemed to speak, as if the image was trying to communicate something to her. Suddenly, Ella's vision blurred, and the room around her began to warp. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper, more oppressive. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "The curse," the figure whispered again, "is waiting for you." Ella snapped her head away from the mirror, but the vision of the old man remained burned into her mind. She took a shaky breath. What had she just seen? And why had she felt so drawn to that mirror? Episode 3. The Shifting Truth. The fog had settled deeper over Raven's Hollow. It was no longer just a veil over the town, but a living entity that seemed to crawl over every surface, seeping into the bones of the buildings and the minds of its inhabitants. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and Ella could no longer deny that something far darker was at play. After the terrifying encounter with the ghostly woman in the inn, Ella had felt the weight of her family's connection to Raven's Hollow in ways she hadn't expected. The mirror's reflection, the haunting image of the old man, had shaken her to her core, but it had also awakened something inside her, an urge to find answers. She had spent hours trying to piece together the fragmented clues, but the more she uncovered, the more the town seemed to shift beneath her feet. Raven's Hollow was not what it seemed. It was a town trapped in time, with every corner hiding a secret that threatened to devour anyone who dared uncover it. The library secrets. Ella's search led her to the town's library, an ancient, crumbling building at the heart of Raven's Hollow. The library had always been a place of knowledge, but it now seemed more like a mausoleum of forgotten tales. Its once grand wooden doors were cracked, and the air inside smelled of dust, mold, and mildew. Ella walked through the doors with a sense of foreboding. The library felt different now, heavier, more oppressive. The silence inside was thick, almost suffocating, broken only by the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. As she made her way past rows of yellow books, her eyes were drawn to an old, locked section of the library. The sign above it read, "Restricted for authorized personnel only." Ella's curiosity got the better of her as she walked closer, pressing her fingers against the cold metal of the lock. The whispers seemed to come from this direction, like a low hum vibrating through the air. She looked around, but no one else was there. Taking a deep breath, she decided to take a chance. She had to know what lay behind that door. The hidden archive. With one swift motion, Ella picked the lock. It wasn't difficult, just a simple twist of her wrist, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway bathed in darkness. The scent of old paper and decay hit her as she stepped inside, and her breath quickened. The hallway led to a small room filled with ancient books, maps, and journals, all meticulously cataloged but clearly abandoned for years. The shelves creaked under the weight of forgotten knowledge, and Ella could sense the presence of something old, ancient, and powerful in the room. On a dusty wooden table, she noticed a peculiar book. It was larger than the others, bound in dark leather with strange symbols etched into its cover. The title was written in a language she didn't recognize, but the faint glow from the cover seemed to beckon her closer. Ella's hand trembled as she reached for the book, the whispers growing louder in her ears, filling her mind with an urgency she couldn't ignore. "Read it," they seemed to say. She opened the book slowly, the pages yellowed and brittle. As she flipped through them, she found what she was looking for, a series of old maps and texts detailing the history of Raven's Hollow and its connection to an ancient curse. The town had been founded centuries ago by a group of settlers who had come from a faraway land, bringing with them a dark secret. an artifact of immense power that had the ability to bring the dead back to life. But at a cost. The artifact was said to be hidden somewhere within Raven's Hollow, protected by a series of trials and ancient rites. The curse that plagued the town was a consequence of those who sought the artifact for themselves, resulting in the restless spirits that still haunted the land. Ella felt a chill run down her spine as she read the final passage of the book. Only those with blood of the old line can break the curse. But be warned, for the cost will be greater than you can imagine. The first trial. As she closed the book, a sudden sound made her freeze. A soft whisper, followed by a scratching sound coming from the far end of the room. Someone or something was in the library with her. Ella's heart pounded as she turned to face the darkness behind her. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the shadows themselves were alive, closing in on her. "Leave this place," the voice hissed. "You have no idea what you're doing." Ella's eyes darted around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, moving in unnatural ways. She wasn't alone. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, her breath visible in the cold air. The spirits were waking. Before she could react, a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, skeletal figure draped in tattered robes. Its face was covered by a hood, but its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light. "You've awakened the first trial," the figure intoned, its voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Now you must face it." Ella's mind raced. What did this mean? The first trial? What had she unleashed by opening that book? The struggle. The figure raised a hand, and Ella felt an invisible force pushing her back. The room seemed to distort around her, the walls closing in. Shadows reached for her, clawing at her skin, pulling her into the dark. She fought against it, but the pressure was too strong. With one final, desperate effort, Ella managed to break free from the dark grasp and rushed toward the door. But before she could escape, the figure's voice echoed in her mind. "This is just the beginning. The first trial is merely a taste of what's to come. You cannot leave until the curse is broken." Ella's heart raced as she burst through the door and fled into the night. The whispers chasing her, the shadows lingering just out of sight. She knew in that moment that the trials had begun, and there was no turning back. Episode 4, The Veil Unraveling. The night in Raven's Hollow had grown darker than ever before. The full moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the town into a perpetual state of shadow. The fog that crept through the narrow streets seemed alive, its dense coils reaching up toward the windows of the houses, like fingers trying to break into the lives of those unfortunate enough to be trapped here. Ella had returned to the old and that had once been the heart of her family's history in the town. But now, everything felt different. There was an unsettling presence in the air, something she couldn't shake off. The whispers had followed her, growing louder with each passing day. They weren't just random voices anymore. They were directed at her, their tone harsh, desperate, and insistent. "You're next," they hissed in her ear. "The veil is thinning." The veil. Ella couldn't stop thinking about those words. The veil between the living and the dead. Her grandmother had warned her about it, told her that there were forces at play in Raven's Hollow that defied explanation, forces that, once awakened, would not rest until they had claimed what was theirs. And now, it seemed it was her turn. She paced back and forth in the dimly lit room of the inn, the flickering candlelight casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. The air smelled of decay, of years of abandonment. It was as if the very walls of the inn were soaked with secrets. Secrets that no one had dared uncover, until now. The disappearing path. Ella couldn't ignore the urge any longer. She had to find the answers. The visions, the whispers, the dark presence that had settled over the town. They were all connected to the curse. She had to uncover the truth. But the more she delved into her family's past, the more she realized how little she actually knew. The inn, which had once been the center of her family's life, now seemed to be holding her hostage. And each time she searched deeper into its history, the more the town itself seemed to fight back, keeping its secrets hidden beneath layers of fear and darkness. As she opened the old journal her grandmother had left behind, the pages fluttered, revealing a map of Raven's Hollow. But unlike any map she had ever seen, this one was older, crumbling with age. The ink faded to near illegibility. But there, in the center, was a symbol she recognized, a symbol her grandmother had drawn in her own handwriting. The symbol was simple, yet powerful, a circle with a jagged line running through the center, representing the split between the worlds. Below the symbol, in faint, barely legible writing, were the words, "The heart of the hollow lies beneath." Beneath, Ella's heart raced as she stared at the map. The heart of the hollow. It had to be real, she thought, and it had to be connected to the dark forces haunting Raven's Hollow. Without hesitation, Ella grabbed her coat and rushed out the inn, the whispers following her every step. She didn't know where the map was leading her, but she knew she had no choice but to follow it. The forgotten path. The town felt different as she walked through the streets, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. The fog was thicker now, almost impenetrable. The town had once been a thriving community, but now it felt like a shadow of its former self. The buildings were crumbling, the once vibrant storefronts now dark and abandoned. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a door or the distant howl of the wind. She followed the map through the town, taking a winding path that led her deeper into the woods. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The silence in the woods was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves beneath her feet. But then, as she walked deeper into the forest, something changed. The air grew colder. The fog thickened, swirling around her like a living entity. And then, just as the map had promised, Ella saw it. A small, hidden clearing opened before her, and at the center stood a massive stone structure. It was ancient, worn by centuries of weather, but still standing tall and proud, a stone circle with intricate carvings etched into the surface. The carvings were unlike anything she had ever seen, depicting strange symbols and figures that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of her lantern. Ella's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the heart of the hollow. But as she stepped closer to the stone circle, a sharp, guttural noise broke the silence. She froze. From the center of the circle, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in dark rags, with a face hidden beneath a hood. "You shouldn't have come," the figure growled, its voice low and menacing. Ella's heart raced, and she took a step back, her mind racing. Who was this person? And why did they seem to know her? "The veil is unraveling," the figure continued, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "And now you are part of it." The truth revealed. The figure stepped forward, its presence commanding the space around them. Ella could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, the air thick with malevolent energy. But something in her refused to retreat. She had come this far. She would not be turned away now. "What is the veil?" Ella asked, her voice trembling but steady. The figure paused, its hollow gaze settling on her. For a moment, there was silence, and then it spoke. "The veil is the barrier between the living and the dead. It is what keeps the darkness at bay. But the veil is weakening, and when it falls, everything will be consumed." Ella's breath caught in her throat. The truth was clearer now, but it only made everything worse. The whispers, the shadows, the darkness, it was all connected to this. And somehow, she was at the center of it all. "You must choose," the figure said, its voice cold. "You can either seal the veil and destroy the darkness, or you can let it consume you." Ella took a deep breath, her mind racing. She didn't know how to fight this darkness, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let it win. Episode 5, The Unseen Path. Ella stood at the edge of the ancient stone circle, heart pounding as she gazed into the swirling abyss that stretched before her. The air had grown heavier, the whispers now clearer and more urgent, swirling around her like 1,000 voices, pleading and threatening at once. The figure, hooded, cloaked in darkness, had vanished, but its words echoed in her mind, resonating deep within her bones. "The veil is unraveling," the words repeated in her head, each one a sharp stab into her very soul. The veil, the barrier between the living and the dead, had been weakening for years, and now Ella was caught in the center of it all. The way of the curse, the trials, and the dark forces that had sought her for generations now threatened to destroy everything she knew. She turned back to the stone circle. The ancient carvings had begun to glow with a faint, eerie light, the symbols shifting as though alive. There was no time to waste. If she didn't act, the consequences would be far worse than she could imagine. "You must choose," the figure had said. "Seal the veil or be consumed." Ella's mind was a swirl of thoughts, confusion, and fear, but one thing was clear. She could not let the darkness win. The hidden passage. With determination, she stepped forward, her feet brushing against the cool stone. The moment she did, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the air vibrated, and the walls of the circle seemed to close in on her, enveloping her in shadows. Ella gasped, clutching the pendant her grandmother had given her, the one she had worn for as long as she could remember. The cold metal felt warm against her skin, as if it was pulsing with an energy of its own. Could this be the key? As she stepped further into the circle, the air seemed to part before her, revealing a hidden path, a dark passage leading deep into the earth. The shadows swirled around her, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just voices in the wind. They were a part of her, invading her thoughts, her very essence. "Follow the path," the voices urged. "It will lead you to the truth." The passage was narrow, the walls slick with an unknown substance, like the very earth was alive, watching her every step. The temperature dropped, and Ella's breath came out in clouds, the icy chill seeping into her bones. She hesitated, but then pressed forward, determined to uncover the secrets hidden beneath Raven's Hollow, no matter the cost. The Chamber of Echoes. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its size impossible to comprehend. The ceiling was lost in darkness, the air heavy with the scent of decay and ancient dust. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, worn with age but still imposing. Upon it was a crystal orb, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Ella's eyes locked onto the orb. This was it. This was the artifact, the key to everything that had been hidden. But as she stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, deafening, frantic, almost desperate. "Don't touch it," they screamed. "You don't understand." Ella paused, her hand just inches from the orb. She could feel the energy radiating from it, a pulsating force that seemed to call to her, pulling her in. But she knew better than to trust the whispers. Hadn't they led her astray before? With a final breath, she touched the orb. The moment her fingers made contact, a blinding flash of light filled the room. Her body was thrust backward, and for a moment she felt weightless, as though she was floating through time and space itself. And then everything went black, the world beyond. When Ella's vision returned, she found herself standing in a vast, empty landscape. The ground beneath her was cracked and dry. The sky overhead an unnatural shade of crimson. The air smelled of sulfur, and the ground trembled as though the very earth was in pain. "Where am I?" she whispered, but the sound of her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. She tried to move, but her feet felt heavy, like the ground itself was trying to pull her down into its depths. The whispers had stopped, leaving only a deafening silence in their wake. There was no sound, no movement, just the endless, barren landscape stretching in all directions. "This is the other side." A voice boomed, sending a shock through Ella's body. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it felt like it was inside her mind. "The veil is torn," the voice continued, "and you have crossed into the domain of the lost. This is where the curse began, and this is where it will end." Ella's heart raced. She had heard of the realm of the lost, an ancient, forbidden place where the souls of the damned were trapped, unable to pass into the afterlife. But why was she here? She looked around, her mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. What had she unleashed? And how was she supposed to stop it? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to crack, and from the depths of the earth, shadowy figures began to rise. They were tall and distorted, their forms shifting like smoke, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Their presence was suffocating, their very being exuding malevolence. "You shouldn't have come here," one of them hissed, its voice echoing to the barren landscape. Ella stumbled backward, fear surging through her veins. She didn't know what these creatures were, but she knew they were not of this world, and they weren't here to help her. The final decision. As the figures closed in on her, Ella felt a cold, gripping sense of inevitability. This was it, the final trial, The figure who had warned her in the chamber stepped forward, its face hidden in shadow. "You have come to the end of your journey," it intoned, its voice calm, almost soothing. "Now you must choose. Will you seal the veil, or will you allow the darkness to consume everything?" Ella looked into the abyss before her, the endless void stretching out into eternity. The weight of the choice pressed down on her, suffocating her. But she had come too far to turn back now. Her fingers tightened around the pendant she wore, the one her grandmother had given her all those years ago. She had always wondered why she had been drawn to it, why it felt so important. Now she understood. It was her only hope. With a steadying breath, she made her choice. Episode 6. The Shattered Reality. The moon hung low in the sky, obscured by a shroud of dark clouds. Raven's Hollow had never felt more suffocating, its streets empty, its buildings looming like silent, disapproving witnesses to the unfolding horror. Ella's footsteps echoed in quiet night, her mind racing, her heart pounding against her chest. The truth had been revealed to her, but the deeper she dug, the further she was sucked into the abyss of darkness. The veil between the living and the dead was breaking, and she was trapped in the middle. The whispers had followed her everywhere, guiding her, tormenting her, growing stronger by the day. They were no longer just voices in the wind. They had become a part of her, a constant presence in the recesses of her mind. The darkness was calling, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. The consequence of knowledge. Ella had spent days poring over the ancient journals and artifacts she'd found in the hidden chambers of Raven's Hollow's old library. Each page, each symbol, had unveiled new horrors, and she was no closer to understanding what the truth meant. The dark forces at play had been buried for centuries, but now, with every passing moment, they were coming closer to the surface. Her grandmother's warnings, the cryptic symbols, the haunting figures, it was all connected. The veil was not just a physical barrier. It was the fabric of reality itself. And by uncovering the secrets of the past, Ella had torn it apart. The shadowy figure she had encountered in the woods had made it clear. She had unleashed something far worse than she could comprehend. The time for running was over. Ella had to face whatever waited for her, or the town of Raven's Hollow would fall to the darkness. The journey deeper. The air had become thick with the promise of impending doom. Ella couldn't escape it any longer. The town itself seemed to be rotting from the inside out, its streets dark and empty, the buildings leaning as though the weight of the past was too much for them to bear. The people who remained in Raven's Hollow were barely visible, too frightened to leave their homes, too haunted to speak of the things they had witnessed. Ella had one last destination in mind, the old chapel at the edge of town. Her grandmother's journals had mentioned it briefly, an ancient place where the veil between the worlds had first been weakened. If the answers lay anywhere, they would be there. As she approached the chapel, she could feel a heavy presence in the air, an oppressive force that seemed to watch her every move. The stone structure loomed ahead, its windows dark, its doors heavy and uninviting. The chapel had been abandoned for years, but something inside told Ella that it was still very much alive. With trembling hands, she pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, as though the very act of opening it disturbed something ancient and slumbering within. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, the faint scent of old wood and forgotten prayers. The chapel felt cold, colder than the outside world, as though the warmth of life had long since fled. The unseen witness. Ella stepped deeper into the chapel, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The silence was suffocating, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every inch of the space seemed to be watching her, the shadows lingering just beyond her reach. The once grand stained glass windows now appeared cracked and shattered, letting in the dim light of the moon. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. As Ella moved toward the altar, she stopped. There, on the stone floor, was a symbol she had seen before. It was etched into the floor in faded, cracked lines, surrounded by a circle of runes. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the seal, the one her grandmother had warned her about. The whispers grew louder now, reverberating off the walls, swirling around her. "It's time," they whispered. "It's time to finish what you started." Before she could react, the temperature dropped sharply. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall, gaunt man, draped in tattered robes, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. He was skeletal in appearance, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes glowing faintly from beneath the hood. "You shouldn't have come here," the man hissed, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You have awakened something that was never meant to be disturbed." Ella stepped back, fear flooding her veins. What had she awoken? The man raised a hand, and a gust of wind howled through the chapel, sending the nearby candles flickering and extinguishing. "You must stop now," he warned. "The darkness is already here." The rift. The figure stepped forward, and with each step, the ground trembled beneath Ella's feet. She felt the very fabric of reality rippling, as if the veil itself was beginning to collapse. "You cannot stop it," the figure continued, his voice now echoing with an unearthly power. "The rift is open. The curse cannot be undone." Ella's mind raced. The rift? Was this what her grandmother had feared? The destruction of the veil? She couldn't allow this to happen. Not after everything she had been through. With every ounce of her strength, Ella grabbed the pendant her grandmother had given her. The pendant that had been passed down through generations. It was the key to sealing the veil. But just as she reached for it, the figure moved to block her path. "You are too late," he sneered. "The rift is already here. And now, you will suffer the consequences." The final stand. Ella's heart raced as she faced the figure. The rift was open, the very fabric of reality beginning to tear apart. But she couldn't give up. Not now. With a cry, she threw herself toward the altar, her hands clutching the pendant tightly. The moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, a surge of power coursed through her, sending a shock wave through the chapel. The figure screamed, his form beginning to disintegrate into shadows. "No!" he cried, his voice filled with rage and fear. "You can't stop it." But Ella didn't stop. She held on to the pendant with every ounce of strength she had, willing it to close the rift, willing the darkness to retreat. The shadows writhed, pushing against her, but the light from the pendant grew brighter, illuminating the entire chapel. Finally, with a deafening roar, the rift closed and the shadows vanished. The aftermath. The chapel fell silent, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting from her shoulders. Ella stood there, trembling, her mind reeling. The whispers were gone, and the chapel was still once more. But she knew that this was only temporary. The darkness had been sealed for now, but the curse was not gone. "This is just the beginning," the voice whispered, echoing in her mind. "The veil will never truly be whole again." Episode 7, Beneath the Surface. The wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it a chill that seemed to cut through to the very bone. The small coastal town of Doomwell had always been quiet, its inhabitants content with their peaceful lives. But in the past few weeks, something had changed. A deep, unnatural quiet had settled over the town, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lena had never been one to believe in things like the supernatural, but there was no denying the events that had unfolded since the storm. The whispers, the cold that clung to her skin, and the strange dreams that had become harder and harder to ignore. It was all connected. She could feel it in her bones. The town had hidden its secrets for too long, and now, those secrets were beginning to claw their way to the surface. The night was the worst. The whispers were loudest then, filling her ears as she lay in bed. Voices that didn't belong to anyone she knew. At first, she thought it was her imagination running wild, but the longer they lingered, the more real they became. And then the dreams started. Dreams of endless dark waters, of something rising from the depths, an ancient force awakening, angry and hungry. It was as though the town was built on a ticking time bomb, and Lena could feel it. She had to find out what was happening before it was too late. The return to the cliffside. It had been a week since the storm, and Lena couldn't get the image of the cliffside out of her mind. The place where the waves crashed against jagged rocks, and where, just days earlier, she'd seen the shadowy figure standing at the edge of the abyss. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her presence, but there had been something in its stillness, something in the way it gazed into black waters that had chilled her to the core. That same feeling gripped her now as she stood at the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping through her hair. The ocean stretched out before her, vast and endless, the waves crashing violently against the shore. The moonlight cast long shadows. painting the rocks in shades of silver and black. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she walked closer to the edge. She couldn't explain it, but she felt drawn to the abyss, drawn to the place where the whispers had originated. She had to know what lay beneath the surface, what was waiting just out of sight. "It's calling me," she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible above the roar of the waves. "I don't know why, but I can't ignore it anymore." The whispers had become unbearable the past few nights, growing louder, more insistent. They had become part of her waking thoughts, haunting her in the quiet moments when she was alone with her mind. They spoke of things she didn't understand, of promises and threats, of a power beneath the water that had waited for centuries. "The abyss calls," the voice whispered in her mind, as though answering her unspoken thought. "And soon it will be too late to turn back." The ancient seal. Her feet moved without thought, carrying her closer to the water's edge. The wind picked up, sending a shiver down her spine. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the very earth was shifting, preparing to give way. Lena's breath caught in her throat as her eyes caught sight of something in the distance, a shape rising from the depths of the water. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a dark, massive form breaking the surface of the ocean, its shape shifting and warping with every passing second, as if it were both solid and fluid at the same time. Her feet froze, her heart racing as the figure loomed larger. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, more urgent. It was coming. The abyss was reaching up to claim her, to drag her into the dark waters. Lena stumbled backward, but before she could turn and run, the ground beneath her gave way. Her body plunged into the darkness. The descent, her scream was swallowed by the wind as she fell, tumbling into the abyss. The water rushed to meet her, cold and unforgiving. She gasped for air as the dark depths closed in around her. The ocean was alive, its currents pulling her deeper and deeper into black void below. For a moment, she thought she was drowning, thought she would never see the light again. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the water stilled, the pressure released, and Lena found herself suspended in an eerie calm. She opened her eyes, blinking away the water that clung to her lashes. What she saw was nothing like she had expected. The water was clear, impossibly so, and she was no longer sinking. Around her, the ocean floor stretched out like a vast, ancient city, its stone structures rising from the dark depths. There were statues, broken and weathered, their features worn away by time. And at the center of it all was a structure unlike anything she had ever seen, a towering, jagged spire that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. But these weren't the same whispers. These were voices from the past, voices of those who had come before her, voices of people long since forgotten. "You should not have come here," the voices hissed in unison. "The abyss claims all who seek its power." The awakening. Lena's head spun as she struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. The city beneath the ocean was ancient, its structures carved with symbols she didn't understand. There was an undeniable power here, something far older than the town of Dunewell, something that had been buried for centuries. She felt it then, the presence, the force that had been pulling her toward the abyss. It was no accident. The town, the storm, the whispers, they had all been leading her here to this very moment. The spire at the center of the city began to glow, its stone surface shimmering with ethereal light. The energy around her thickened, wrapping itself around her like a physical force. And then she understood the abyss was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to open the door. The final choice. Lena's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, more frenzied. The entity in the abyss was awakening, and with it, a power that had been dormant for centuries. It was ready to rise. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the stone of the spire. The surface was cold, but beneath her touch, she felt a hum of power, a pulse that sent a shiver through her body. "You cannot stop it," the voices whispered, now taunting her. "It will consume you, just as it consumed all who came before you." But Lena was determined. She had come too far to turn back now. The abyss had chosen her, and she would not allow it to claim her soul. With a final breath, She placed her palm flat against the spire, activating the ancient seal. The light around her blazed, and for a moment, the ocean seemed to stand still. Episode 8, The Unseen Depths. Lena stood on the precipice, staring out into the inky blackness of the abyss. The storm had passed, but it left behind a lingering sense of dread that seemed to wrap around her like a suffocating fog. The town of Doomwell was eerily quiet tonight, as if holding its breath in anticipation of something far more sinister than the storm could ever bring. She had been hearing the whispers again, just beneath the surface of her thoughts. They came every night now, insistent, urgent, calling her, demanding answers. The more she tried to ignore them, the louder they became. And tonight, they seemed to be pushing her toward the edge of the cliffs. The very same cliffs where everything had started. Lena could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on her shoulders, a force she could neither name nor escape. The abyss was no longer just a distant, abstract concept. It was something personal, something tied to her bloodline. She could feel it in her veins, the same pull her ancestors must have felt before her. The answers lie within, the voice whispered, so close that it seemed to come from the very air around her. You must ascend into the depths, Lena. Only then will you understand. Her heartbeat quickened as the winds shifted, carrying with them an unnatural chill. The cliffs were empty, silent, save for the roar of the ocean below. But there was something about the emptiness that felt wrong. She had never been afraid of the sea before, but tonight, it felt alive. A glimpse into the abyss. Lena had turned away from the cliff's edge, her mind racing. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. But this was different. The pull of the abyss was irresistible, yet terrifying. She had to know what lay below, what secrets were hidden in the deep, what had happened to the townsfolk. The whispers spoke of them. Some had disappeared, others driven mad by visions of the abyss. But Lena refused to believe the town had simply succumbed to a curse. There had to be a reason, a hidden truth buried beneath the surface. As Lena made her way to the old lighthouse, her footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope for sailors, now stood like a decaying sentinel guarding the secrets of the sea. The lighthouse keeper, an old man named Tobias, had been a close friend of her grandmother. He was the one who had warned her of the dangers of the abyss, the one who had spoken of ancient rites and forgotten rituals that had been practiced by the townspeople long ago. But Tobias had gone silent, a shadow of the man he once was. His warnings had been cryptic, his fears growing by the day. The descent. Lena reached the lighthouse door and paused. She could sense something in the air, an energy, a charge, that sent a shiver through her spine. It was almost as if the very ground beneath her feet was alive, waiting for her to make the next move. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The musty smell of old wood and salt water filled her lungs as she stepped inside. The light was dim, casting long shadows across the floor. The walls were lined with old books and strange trinkets, some of them covered in dust, others still humming with an odd energy. At the far end of the room was a spiral staircase, leading down into the heart of the lighthouse. The air was thick with tension, and Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She had no choice. She had to go down. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended deeper into the lighthouse's bowels. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were no longer just voices in the wind. They were inside her head. "Come closer, Lena," the voice cooed. "Feel the truth. Embrace what lies beneath." Her heart raced, but she pushed forward. The deeper she went, the colder it became. The walls were damp, slick with moisture. There was a feeling of decay in the air, the smell of rot, of something ancient and forgotten. The very air seemed to press against her, suffocating her with its weight. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, Lena was met with a heavy iron door. It was ajar, just a crack, but enough to let the faintest sliver of light escape from within. The room beyond was dark, almost impenetrable, but she could feel it, the pull of something vast, something powerful. Without thinking, she pushed open the door, the heart of the abyss. The room was cavernous, stretching far beyond what she had expected. The walls were lined with strange symbols, some carved into the stone, others painted with dark, unnatural hues. The floor was uneven, like the remnants of a forgotten ritual. But it wasn't a room that caught her attention. It was what lay at the center. There, in the middle of the room, was a large stone altar, ancient and worn. And on the altar, lying motionless, was a book. But it wasn't just any book. It was bound in what seemed to be human skin, and its pages were stained with what looked like blood. The whispers in Lena's mind grew louder, the words becoming clearer. "The truth lies within," the voice murmured. "The book contains the final key. But beware, for the abyss will claim you if you open it." Lena reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed against the book's cover. The whispers surged, filling her ears, deafening her. She could feel the darkness pulling at her, trying to drag her into the very depths of the abyss. The final revelation. With a shaky breath, Lena opened the book. The pages were thick and brittle. The ink faded with time, but the words were unmistakable. The rituals, the history of the abyss, the power that had been buried beneath the town. As she read, the world around her seemed to shift. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the walls of the lighthouse vibrating with an ancient energy. And then she understood. The abyss was not just a place. It was a living entity. It had been waiting for centuries, and it had been manipulating the town of Dunewell, feeding off its people, using them to break the seal that had kept it contained. The storm had been a catalyst, the key to unlocking the rift that had held the abyss at bay. And now the abyss was awake. Episode 9, The Depths of the Unknown. Lena's breath hitched as she stood at the edge of the water, her heart pounding like the roar of the waves crashing against the shore. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its silver light illuminating the sea below. But the water didn't look like it belonged to this world. There was something wrong with it, something unnatural. It churned restlessly, as if alive. Something waited beneath the surface, its presence far more ancient and terrifying than anything Lena could comprehend. The whispers had become unbearable over the past few nights, soft, insistent voices that called her name. And now, they were louder than ever, echoing in her mind like a distant drumbeat from the deep. She had thought the storm had brought them, that it had opened some kind of gateway into the abyss. But it was more than that. It had awakened something. She had to go back. She had to understand. Lena swallowed hard and stepped forward, her feet sinking into the wet sand. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was warning her not to go any further. But she couldn't stop now. She needed to know. She had felt the pull in her bones, in her very soul. The town of Dunewell had changed. The people had changed. They had become different, more distant, more afraid. And she had become part of this dark, ancient thing. The very thought of it sent a chill through her body. The whispers guided her now, louder, more urgent. "The abyss is calling, Lena," the voice whispered in her ear, as if it were right next to her. "It has always called you." The descent. As Lena approached the water's edge, she noticed something unusual. The waves seemed to pull back, almost like they were receding, revealing the blackened depths of the sea beneath. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had been charged with energy she couldn't explain. The shore began to disappear, the land slowly sinking into the abyss. Her pulse quickened as she stumbled backward. The ground was giving way beneath her feet. Her thoughts raced, but there was no time to process. She felt it now. The force, a dark, pulsating power that seemed to call to her, urging her to follow. It was intoxicating, like a drug. And for the first time, she felt the true weight of the abyss calling her. The deep, endless void that had been whispering for so long. Suddenly, a vision of a figure appeared in the swirling darkness, standing in the water, calling to her. It was a man, dressed in tattered robes, his face obscured by shadows. But his eyes were glowing, bright and unnatural. Lena froze. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly raised his hand. It was him, the one who had been calling her from the depths, the one who had sent the storm. "Come closer," he beckoned, his voice echoing in the night, distant yet filled with command. "The truth awaits you." A deluge of truth. Without thinking, Lena stepped forward, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't know what she was expecting, but as she approached the figure, The air seemed to shift. The world around her grew heavy, the dark sky twisting and riding above her. "What is this?" Lena gasped, her voice shaky as she stood just inches from the shadowed figure. His eyes were so intense, burning with an otherworldly glow. "You already know," the figure said, his voice full of ancient wisdom. "This is the abyss, the darkness that lies beneath, the hunger that feeds on all who dare to seek it." Lena's mind reeled as she tried to process the words. Her throat was dry, her body trembling. The abyss, the hunger. The words seemed to resonate with something deep inside her, something primal. The figure stepped closer, his form shifting with the waves. "You are part of this, Lena, part of the ancient truth." His voice was smooth, yet there was an underlying warning in it. "You've always been part of it." Lena opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, the figure raised his hand again, silencing her. The ocean around them began to swirl, the currents picking up speed, pulling them both toward the abyss. "It's time for you to learn the truth," the figure whispered. "Time for you to know what lies beneath the surface, to understand the darkness that has always waited." The ground beneath Lena's feet cracked open, and before she could react, she was plunged into the water, into the abyss. Lena's body hit the water with a violent splash, and for a moment, the world went black. She struggled to breathe as the cold, suffocating depths wrapped around her like a vice. Panic surged through her chest as she fought to keep her head above the water, but the current was too strong. The deeper she was pulled into the abyss, the harder it became to breathe. The whispers had grown louder again, reverberating in her mind like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "The abyss takes all who enter," they whispered. "There is no escape." Her body felt heavy, the weight of the water dragging her deeper into the unknown. Her eyes burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop herself. The abyss was claiming her. And then, just as she thought she could hold on no longer, something shifted beneath her. The water cleared, and the pressure seemed to lessen. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes. What she saw made her blood run cold. The water was no longer dark. It was clear, almost too clear, revealing the truth beneath. The world below the surface wasn't empty. It was alive. There, in the depths, she saw what had been pulling her down. A vast, sprawling city, its streets lined with decayed buildings and broken statues. There were remnants of an ancient civilization, lost to time, and beneath it all was an energy that seemed to pulse with life. Alive, but not human. Something ancient, powerful, and hungry. "You must face it," the voice whispered in her mind, louder now than ever before. "You must become one with it." The city stretched out before her, its dark towers looming in the distance. She didn't know what waited for her down there, but she knew one thing. She could never turn back. Episode 10, The Call of the Deep. Lena stood before the vast expanse of the abyss, her heart hammering in her chest. The sea stretched out in front of her, dark and uninviting, like an endless void. The wind whipped through her hair, biting at her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her thoughts were consumed by the pull of the ocean. The whispers had returned, more powerful than ever, and they were leading her here, leading her to the edge of everything. "You have to face it," the voice murmured inside her mind. "The truth lies below. You must see it to understand." She had been hearing the whispers for weeks now. At first, they were faint, like distant echoes just beyond the reach of her hearing. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled her every waking thought. She could no longer ignore them. They had become part of her, like a second voice in her head, urging her forward, guiding her towards something she couldn't yet comprehend. The abyss was calling her, and no matter how much she resisted, she knew deep down that she would have to answer. The descent. Lena took a hesitant step forward, her feet sinking into the cold sand. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore echoed in her ears, drowning out everything else. The water seemed to shimmer in the pale moonlight, as though it were alive, breathing, watching her. Her stomach churned, and her palms grew clammy, but she couldn't turn away. The whispers grew louder. "Come closer," they urged. "It's waiting. You're meant to see it." Lena's heart raced as she moved closer to the water's edge. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, heavy with salt and something darker, something ancient. She could feel the pull of the sea now, like a physical force, tugging at her, urging her to step into its depths. With a deep breath, Lena stepped into the water. It was colder than she expected, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She shivered, but she didn't stop. The water rose higher, lapping at her knees, then her waist, until it was up to her chest. The whispers intensified, their voices almost deafening now, calling her forward. "It's time," they urged. Lena felt a strange pressure in her chest, as though the water was pushing her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The sea was alive and it wanted her. Her feet no longer touched the ground. The water swirled around her, and she was carried away by the current, her body weightless, her heart pounding in her chest. She struggled to breathe, but the water seemed to press against her, filling her lungs, making her dizzy. "This is it," the voice whispered. "This is the moment. There's no turning back now." The darkness below. As the darkness of the abyss swallowed her, Lena could see nothing but the black void beneath her. The water was thick with shadows, swirling around her, but there was something else, something moving beneath the surface. She wasn't alone. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, rising slowly from the depths like a specter. It was a man, or at least, it resembled one. His features were distorted, twisted by the water, but there was something undeniably human about him. His eyes, glowing with an eerie light, locked onto hers, and for a moment, Lena felt a wave of fear so powerful that it nearly paralyzed her. But she couldn't look away. She couldn't move. The figure reached out to her, his hand just inches from hers. "You've come to see," the voice said, but it wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in the water, around her, in the very air she breathed. "You've come to understand." Lena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The pressure of the water increased, and she could feel herself being pulled toward the figure. She fought to stay afloat, but it was no use. She was sinking, and the figure's hand was now inches from her own, a dark, inviting touch. "Come," the figure whispered, his voice both soothing and terrifying. "Embrace the abyss. Let it show you what lies beneath." And then she fell. The other world. The world shifted. Lena's vision blurred, and the sensation of falling became overwhelming. She was no longer in the water. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere ancient. Her feet landed softly on solid ground, but it wasn't the familiar shore she had left behind. She was in a cavern, its walls slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of decay and salt. The abyss was alive here, in this place. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if the very stone was alive. The ground trembled beneath her, and Lena realized that she was no longer alone. Figures moved in the shadows, barely visible but unmistakable. They were the lost souls of the abyss, trapped between worlds, forever bound to the darkness that dwelled beneath the sea. Their eyes glowed like embers, flickering in the dark, and their whispers filled the air like the distant sound of 1,000 voices calling out from beyond. Lena tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The abyss had claimed her, and then the figure from before stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. "You have crossed into the realm of the lost," it said, its voice a low growl that reverberated through her bones. "This is the place where time does not exist, where souls are forever bound to the depths. You are no longer just a visitor. You are one of us now." Lena wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She was trapped in the abyss with no way out. The truth unfolds. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and placed it on Lena's shoulder. "You were always meant to be here," it whispered. "You are the key. The abyss has been waiting for you." Lena's mind raced. The abyss, the whispers, everything she had experienced had led to this moment. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of the abyss. The truth hit her like a freight train. The abyss wasn't just a place. It was a force, a being that existed beyond the confines of time and space. It had been waiting for her, calling to her for years. And now she was bound to it. This is only the beginning, the figure said, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The abyss will consume everything, and you are the one who will bring it all to the surface. Lena's heart stopped. She could feel the weight of her destiny pressing down on her, the weight of the abyss pulling her deeper into its grip, and there was no escape. Episode 11, The Rising Depths. Lena woke in darkness, her body heavy with the weight of the unknown. The whispering voices that haunted her for so long had quieted, leaving only the deafening silence of the abyss around her. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but the murkiness was unyielding. She could feel the damp air, thick with decay, curling against her skin. It smelled of salt and rot, the scent of things forgotten, things lost in the endless sea. But she wasn't alone. Lena's heart thudded in her chest as a cold hand brushed against hers. She jerked back, her breath caught in her throat, but there was nothing there, no figure, no presence. Yet the touch lingered, an eerie memory etched into her skin. "You're not alone," a voice murmured from the shadows, low and insidious. "You've never been alone." Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was the same one that had called her to the depths of the ocean, the same one that had urged her to walk into the abyss. It was the voice of the figure, the one from the water, the one who had claimed her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible against the oppressive silence. "I am what you have become," the voice replied, its tone calm yet heavy with meaning. "And you are more than you ever were before. You are part of the abyss now, Lena." Lena's mind reeled. Part of the abyss? What did that even mean? She tried to stand, but her limbs felt like lead, as though the very air she breathed was pulling her deeper into the ground. It was as if the abyss had become her prison, and she was shackled to it, forever bound by the darkness that surrounded her. The echoes of the lost. Lena's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but everything was shrouded in shadows. The air was thick, the kind of darkness that felt heavy, as though it were pressing against her chest. She could hear faint echoes in the distance, voices whispering in an ancient language she couldn't understand. "You have entered the domain of the lost," the voice whispered again, this time closer. "The dead do not rest here. The souls of forgotten are trapped in this place, and you will join them." Lena's pulse quickened as she tried to move, but her legs were uncooperative, stiff as though they were submerged in concrete. Her thoughts were muddled, clouded by the weight of what she had just been told. The abyss, the lost souls. Was this what awaited her now? "There is no escape," the voice murmured again, its tone softer now, as if it were speaking directly into her mind. "You will never leave. You are a part of this now." Her heart pounded in her chest. Was this the price of uncovering the truth? Was this the price of listening to the whispers? "But I don't want to be part of it," she breathed, panic rising in her throat. "I just want to go back." The voice laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold, empty sound of despair. "You're not allowed to go back. The abyss does not let go." Lena's eyes stung as she looked around. There were shapes now, shifting in the shadows. The outlines of figures, people, moving slowly, their forms distorted by the oppressive darkness. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow, staring at her with a hunger she couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward, its form clear now in the dim light. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. His face was gaunt, his features sunken and pale, as though time had eaten away at his very being. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, but they were not alive. "Lena," the figure whispered, his voice cracked and hoarse. "You shouldn't have come." "Who are you?" Lena asked, trembling. The figure tilted his head, the eerie glow of his eyes intensifying. "I am the keeper," he said, "the keeper of the lost. I guard those who have entered the abyss and never returned." Lena's mind raced. She had heard of stories, of those who disappeared, swallowed by the sea, never to be seen again. Had they ended up here, trapped in this place between life and death? The man, the keeper, stepped closer, his hollow eyes never leaving hers. "You were chosen," he said. "You were always meant to come here. The abyss calls to those who are destined to enter it. And once you do, there is no return." The revelation. Lena's mind was spinning. She felt as though she were on the edge of a precipice. staring into the void. She had uncovered something she was never meant to know, something far darker than she could have ever imagined. The abyss wasn't just a place, it was a force, a presence, one that had been waiting for her. Why me? Lena gasped, her voice trembling. Why did it choose me? The keeper's smile was twisted, almost pitying. Because you were always part of it, Lena. The whispers, they're not just voices. They are the call of the abyss, reaching out to those who are destined to listen, to those who can hear. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It had been calling her. She had thought it was madness, a trick of the mind, but now she realized the truth. The abyss was alive. It was real, and it had chosen her. What happens now? Lena whispered. The keeper's gaze softened, a dark sadness in his eyes. Now, you begin your transformation. The abyss will claim you, and you will become one with it, just as we all have. Lena's heart sank. She didn't want to be a part of this. She didn't want to join these lost souls, these trapped spirits, but she felt the pull. It was irresistible. The abyss was taking her, slowly, piece by piece. She closed her eyes, but the darkness consumed her vision. It was too late. There was no escape. Episode 12, Beneath the Surface. Lena stood at the edge of the cliff, staring down into the churning abyss below. The waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks, sending a spray of salty mist into the air. There was something primal about the sight, the way the ocean raged with force that felt as if it could swallow everything in its path. But it was more than that. It was as if the sea was calling her, beckoning her into the deep. The whispers were louder now, no longer just a distant murmur in her mind. They filled her thoughts, swirling around her like the very ocean she had come to fear. Lena, the voice was familiar, haunting. Come closer. The truth lies below. She shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. She had heard the voice before many times in the quietest corners of her mind, but never so forcefully. The voice of the abyss was closer now than ever before, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but there was no one. The wind had died down, leaving behind an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. The cliffs were empty. The world was empty, and yet she could feel it. The pull of the water, the weight of the abyss drawing her in. It was an inevitability. No matter how hard she fought against it, she could not escape. The descent. Lena took a step forward, her feet barely making a sound on the rocky ground beneath her. The distance between her and the water seemed vast, but in that moment, it felt like it was nothing at all. Her body moved on its own accord, guided by something other than her own will. The whispers in her head became louder, more insistent, urging her onward. She tried to resist, but her body betrayed her. Another step, then another. Before she knew it, she was standing at the very edge, the dark waters lapping at the rocks below, its depths hidden from sight. Don't fight it, the voice whispered once more. You are meant for this. This is your calling. You cannot escape the abyss. She closed her eyes, her heart racing in her chest, but the pull was too strong. She felt as if something deep within her had already been consumed by the sea, something that could never return. I don't want this, she whispered, but the words felt weak, as though the sea had already swallowed them. A walk into darkness. With no other choice, Lena took a deep breath and stepped off the edge. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to freeze around her as she fell, her body weightless, suspended between the sky and the sea. And then, with a sickening lurch, she hit the water. The coldness of it took her breath away, and for a moment, she panicked. The waves pulled her under, but her body didn't fight it. There was no struggle, no fight for air. The water was an old friend, one that had been waiting for her for years. As she sank deeper, the water closing around her, the whispers intensified. They came from all directions, from the depths of the sea, from the very soul of the abyss. The sound was deafening now, an overwhelming cacophony of voices. Each one seemed to be speaking to her, telling her the secrets of the deep, the things she had longed to know but was never meant to understand. You have always belonged here, the voice said, almost tenderly. This is where you were meant to be. Lena's lungs burned as she descended deeper into the cold, and yet she felt no fear. The water was not her enemy. It was her home. The abyss had always been her home. And as she continued to sink, something strange happened. The darkness of the ocean began to shift, to take form. Shapes emerged from the depths, creatures, perhaps, or figures from her nightmares, stretching toward her, their eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. "Come closer, Lena," the voice coaxed. "We have been waiting for you." The creatures swam around her, their long, shadowy forms brushing against her skin, and yet she felt no discomfort. Instead, there was a strange comfort, a sense of belonging she couldn't explain. "Who are you?" she gasped, her voice a mere whisper against the deafening noise of the abyss. "We are the ones who have been forgotten," the voice replied, its tone cold and ancient. "The lost souls, the ones who were consumed by the sea. And now you will join us." Lena's eyes widened as she realized the truth. The abyss didn't just swallow ships. It swallowed people, their souls trapped in its depths forever. And now, she was one of them. The revelation, as the darkness around her thickened. Lena felt herself being pulled deeper still, further than she had ever gone before. The water seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and the creatures followed, swirling around her like shadows in the deep. And then there it was, the truth, the secret of the abyss. The abyss wasn't just a place. It was a being, a consciousness. It had been waiting for her to cross into its domain, so that it could consume her, just as it had consumed so many others. "The abyss is alive," the voice whispered, its presence now overwhelming. "It has always been alive, and you are a part of it now." Lena's heart twisted in her chest as the realization hit her like a wave. The abyss was more than just a place. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that thrived on the souls it consumed. And she was now one of those souls, forever bound to the depths of the ocean, a prisoner of its dark will. The end? As Lena's vision blurred, the coldness of the water consuming her senses, she knew there was no escape. She had crossed the point of no return. She had stepped into the abyss, and now it had claimed her. But just before everything went dark, just before the abyss swallowed her completely, a single thought flickered through her mind. Is this the end? But even as the darkness closed in, she knew that the answer didn't matter. The abyss would never let her go. She was part of it now, and it would never let her forget.